The topic for today is gender and modern Indian historiography. So what we see is that feminist scholars distinguish three terms that are often used interchangeably while talking of women. Basically, they talk of women, gender, and sex. So the commonsensical term woman, according to feminists, is neither a natural category of non-men nor a homogeneous community of sisterhood, for there are historically many ways of being a woman in different times and different places, depending on the gendering of a society. So just as languages are gendered in different ways, so are societies and nations, and it is this gendering which produces different models of being women and men, feminine and masculine. Gender, in other words, is not a natural or biological identity of a person. It is a historical, social and political construction of how to be a man or a woman. Sex, on the other hand, has been conventionally seen as the biological ground upon which gender is constructed. However, feminist scholars today argue that even sex is not a purely natural fact. Sexualities too are socially produced and regulated by dominant discourses which establish one kind of sexuality is normal and relegate all others, for example, non-marital, non-monogamous, non-heterosexual, non-reproductive sexualities, into the domain of deviance, perversion or criminality. So let me begin with a very brief review of historiographies on questions of gender in modern India. So if you look at traditional history writing, अगर आप पारंपरिक इतिहास लेखन को देखते हैं तो it was largely written from a male perspective. However, the trajectory of women in colonial India shows that their first historical accounts date mainly from the period of social reforms in the 19th century. And though largely initiated by men, they marked anxious debates around gender questions. Both social reforms and nationalism have had an ambiguous relationship with the gender question, and historiographical shifts point this out vividly. So सबसे पहले अगर हम ब्रिटिश और मिशनरी पर्सपेक्टिव्स को देखते हैं, so what we see is that they viewed the position of women in India before their advent as one of extreme degradation. The condition of women in India became one of the principal means for the empire to justify its civilizing mission and reform the depraved customs of India. James Mill, in his classic work, The History of British India, he argued, that the status of women indicated a society's rung on the ladder of civilization, and India featured way below on this front, according to him. So these writers broadly saw their rule and endeavors as marking a significant improvement in the condition of women. उनके अनुसार ब्रिटिश आए और उन्होंने भारतीय स्त्रियों को एक प्रकार से स्वतंत्रता दिलाई और उनकी स्थिति को बेहतर बनाया. Now, if we look at nationalist writing and reformist writing, अगर हम राष्ट्रवादी और सुधारवादी लेखन की ओर देखते हैं, so they too analyze the social reforms and national movements as a relatively straightforward affair. They also follow a positive teleology, just like the missionaries and British scholars, and they also assumed a step-by-step evolutionary advance in the condition of Indian women. So from social reforms to education to political participation. And they too argued that reforms led to the emancipation of women from the stagnating conditions in which they had been rotting. They further claim that the reforms were a result of indigenous efforts and were not due to British initiatives. तो ये अंतर है ब्रिटिश इतिहासकारों में और राष्ट्रवादी इतिहासकारों में, कि ब्रिटिश इतिहासकार कहते हैं कि स्त्रियों में सुधार हमारे कारण आया, जबकि राष्ट्रवादी और सुधारवादी जो विचारक हैं वो कहते हैं कि वो सुधार हमारे कारण आया। लेकिन दोनों कह रहे हैं कि धीरे धीरे करके स्त्रियों की स्थिति जो है वो बेहतर हुई। And basically, what the Reformist rhetoric and Nationalist rhetoric is saying is that it was our efforts that resulted in this. And there is this kind of uncritical adulation where social reforms emerge as a truly liberating force, which led to the abolition of sati. It led to the end of female infanticide, to female education, widow remarriage, rise in the age of consent, eradication of parda, end of so-called obscene representations of women in literature and art. So, for a section of these writers, of these nationalist writers, it also became important to paint the medieval period as a period of darkness and stagnation, and to vehemently critique it. And simultaneously, the ancient past was depicted as this golden age where women were valued and occupied positions of high status. So, for example, if you look at the discourse or discussions around parda, what you see among the Hindu reformers is, at least a large section of Hindu reformers, is that they first highlighted as a problem that came because of Muslim rule, and they say that it came into force largely due to two reasons, because of unhealthy impact of Muslim customs and as a weapon to shield Hindu women from being attacked by these so-called Westile Muslim males. And Hindu social reforms were depicted as bringing light after a long period of darkness to end all such evils. And in this context, even if you look at nationalism, and its relationship to gender, then also these kind of viewpoints argue for a linear kind of view of history. So a chronicle leap in women's politicization is linked here directly with advances and emancipation and their position. So these early writings saw women in the freedom struggle also largely in the context of participation, and they focused largely on prominent and outstanding women, largely belonging to Hindu middle classes and upper castes. In some ways, as scholars have argued, this became the basis for universalizing the national movement as a whole. Now there has been a critique of these kind of histories of these kind of missionary writings and British writings and some of the nationalist writings, because it has been argued that they offer only a very marginal picture, they offer a very problematic perspective in describing changes in women's status and their conditions through the ages. So, for example, regarding social reforms, these kind of criticisms by feminist scholars, for example, have pointed out that almost all earlier initiatives were largely taken by men, that these writings were about what great men did for women. Also, most of the reformers belonged to upper castes and emerging elite classes, and they compromised with colonialism in many ways. They mainly addressed problems of upper caste, middle class Hindu women. They sometimes distanced themselves from syncretic and popular religious cultural practices, particularly of women. Even if you look at questions of nationalism, what you see is an uneven nature of its development in relation to women. And there were various contradictions that we can see here. So nationalist historians usually narrated women's contribution to nationalism, but they focused mainly on a few women, on exceptional achievers, and not so much on ordinary women. They also did not take into account often the regional variations that were there, in terms of consciousness, and also, differences in consciousness, perceptions, and actions. So, for example, this historian Gail Mino, she gives this very interesting argument. She says that there was this metaphor of the extended family that was deployed by the nationalists, that the whole country was perceived as a family, and the woman's role as a nurturing woman continued, and even in Gandhian movements, participation was seen largely as a religious duty, and of course it signaled a positive change. So many women came out of their homes for the first time. There was a large increase, in women's participation in the nationalist movement, but conservative norms still continued to prevail. And it was believed that once the crisis of, this kind of colonialism would be over and freedom would be achieved, women will go back to their traditional roles. So in some ways, often women's issues were posed in a way that they did not threaten patriarchal societies, and they could sit comfortably with the nationalist movement. So in some ways, you can say that this history was still, being written largely from a male perspective. That is what was much more important. So what we need is to see the gendering of history itself, if we really want to understand history, modern Indian history from a gendered perspective particularly. So in the 1980s, what we see is that there were some very important works that came out. बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण किताबें इस दौर में निकली 1980 के दशक में. उसमें एक बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट किताब जो थी वो थी कुमकुम संगारी और सुदेश वैद की एडिटेड बुक रिकास्टिंग वुमेन. And this was a pioneering anthology, a collection of articles which highlighted some of the historical processes which reconstituted patriarchy in colonial India. And basically it used Marxist and post-colonial frameworks to talk about modern times in India as a period when colonialism introduced a capitalist mode of production, and which in turn threw up a modern middle class of bourgeois men who were dissatisfied with older feudal values and family arrangements. And such men basically tried to emulate British middle class families and create educated Indian wives and mothers who would become good companions to their modern husbands and who would run their families on reformed, enlightened lines. Basically, the various essays in this collection reflected on texts written by men who tried to educate women on lines that would serve their own needs. For example, there was this very important article in the collection by Uma Chakravarti, which critically discussed for the first time the ways in which different categories of modern nationalists have mythicized ancient Hindu histories. And the general editorial argument of the book was that reforms basically re-imprisoned modern women into new cages of male desires. Another significant collection that came out at this time was Women in Colonial India, which was again an edited collection, and a book by Geraldine Forbes called Women in Modern India, which was part of the Cambridge History volumes. Now, if you look at the Women in Colonial India, the first book, which was also called Essays on Survival Work and the State, was its subtitle. They did not have this kind of an overarching framework, but basically they explored specific categories of women and different facets of women's activities, like women in factories, in agricultural labor, in home-based production, how did they use courts, and their participation in nationalist movements. Again, they were bringing new arenas into focus at this time. And finally, this very important book by Geraldine Forbes, Women in Modern India, put forward women's history, by privileging women's own voices. So it attempted to write, women's history through women's own experiences and voices. So these books were very, very significant and important. But there were also some limitations of these books. तो ये प्रारंभिक की जो 1980 के दशक में जो किताबें आई वो बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण थी, लेकिन उसकी कई सीमाएं भी थी. जैसे कि अगर हम रिकास्टिंग वुमेन की बात करते हैं तो वो खुद ही कहते हैं, मतलब वो जो उसके एडिटर्स हैं वो खुद ही कहते हैं कि ये ज्यादातर हिंदुओं के बारे में है. इसमें इसके जो ऐसे हैं डोमिनेंट हिंदू कम्युनिटी के बारे में है. इट वाज लार्जली अबाउट नॉर्थ इंडिया, उत्तर भारत की ओर के पर आधारित थे इसके ज्यादातर essays, and also it dealt mainly with middle class women and men. So if you see, दलित स्त्रियों पे जैसे कि कोई इसमें महत्वपूर्ण लेख नहीं है, किसान स्त्रियों पे है और पेजेंट वुमेन पे है, लेकिन उस तरह से दलित स्त्री और कास्ट जिसको कहना चाहिए एक महत्वपूर्ण बिंदु बन के यहाँ पर नहीं उभर कर आता है. Also, it is again, they did not see, explore what women themselves were doing largely, with new education, with new kinds of voices, etc. So, in that sense, what you can say is that there were certain arenas that it left in darkness. So, for example, some aspects of masculinities or homosexualities, which have emerged as very important dimensions of gender history, that was not looked into. They were mainly emphasizing, the book Recasting Women, it's an amazing collection, but it was mainly emphasizing how patriarchies were recast, but it did not see how it was also destabilized and subverted in this period. That was not so much examined. And also, as later scholars emphasize that, of course, it's important to highlight about patriarchy and violence. These are very, very important. But we also need to talk about aspects of love and pleasure, which are equally important when we look at modern histories of gender in some ways. There was also, in the same period, in the 1980s, another book called The Intimate Enemy by Ashis Nandy, and it has played, some role in its contribution to gender historiography because for various reasons. One is that this book highlighted that we also need to look at issues of masculinities. It is not, when we talk of gender, it is not enough to talk just about women, but we also need to look at how masculinities were recast, strengthened, questioned in this period. And also, so just as, when you look at you need, when you do class analysis, you also need to look at the ruling class. Similarly, when you do gender analysis, you also need to look at histories of men and masculinities. And basically, Ashis Nandy also pointed out that how symbols are also as significant to look at, as participation. And the book presented a critique of modern Western colonialism, and it also said that how the empire was shown as superior and masculine by the British, while the colonized were seen as inferior and effeminate. And what Nandy argued was that how Gandhi subverted these notions of masculinity and femininity by arguing that femininity was something that was worthier and preferred. So Gandhi, basically glorified this ability of women for sacrifice and suffer, and which he identified with women, and so and actually, if you see, in this period, there were various notions of masculinity being worked out by nationalists. So, for example, from Vivekananda to Gandhi, from Sanatan Dharmists to Arya Samajis, सभी जो हैं वो ब्रह्मचर्य को लेकर विवाद कर रहे हैं, ब्रह्मचर्य को एक आधुनिक रूप में वो ढाल रहे हैं. Or for example, House of Jupiter Kaviraj has argued that there was this image of the warrior Krishna that emerged in this period. So there was a different images of manhood that are emerging in this period. In this context, the work of Mrinalini Sinha is also very important, because she sees that how masculinity brings a new kind of richness to gender historiographies of colonial India, and they both complement each other. So, and of course, as I said, debates on masculinity need to be also linked to debates around homosexuality, same-sex love and desire. Again, Ashis Nandy's work has been very important, but there have also been critiques offered, for example, by scholars like Kanika Sarkar, because implicitly, maybe not explicitly, but at times it appears that Ashis Nandy is celebrating the pre-colonial indigenous traditional pasts as not only more tolerant, but as Kanika Sarkar says, but their recovery is presented as the hope for the future. Also, if you look at this, in this time, if you look at the print public sphere, what you see is that it also internally offered challenges to suppression of women's spaces. So, what happens is that while Ashis Nandy's work is very important, at times, all the blame is put on the colonialism, modernity, and enlightenment. They all are clubbed together, and all the problems are put on their shoulders. While the earlier period, before the coming of colonialism, is shown to have much more flexible sexual codes, but actually, this presents only one side of the picture, because actually, as I said, the print public sphere was, which developed, actually was much more dynamic in this period. There's also been this work of Partha Chatterjee, which has proved to be extremely important, in historiographies of modern India. And there are two main arguments that he makes, when he looks at the relationship between social reforms, nationalism, and women. So, the first argument, which is proved to be extremely influential, is that he says that the reformers and the nationalists drew a distinction between the inner and the outer by separating the home and the world. And basically what he says is that while the Indian male had lost out in the public sphere, in the outer sphere, it was in the private and the inner sphere that one in which he could prove his superiority, and where the superiority of India could be proved. and women were perceived as the main harbingers of preserving this spirituality of this inner space. And her body basically became a metaphor of an unviolated chaste space, the ultimate site of virtue, and the last refuge of freedom. And the second important argument that Chatterjee makes is that, with the growth of nationalist movement in early 20th century, the woman's question was co-opted to the larger political project and put on hold pending achievements of other objectives. Now again, a very persuasive argument. It has helped in a large number of, the way in which gender history has come to be viewed. But again, as various scholars and feminist scholars have pointed out, it needs to be qualified to some extent, this argument of Partha Chatterjee. One is that, often while he is very categorical that he's talking of Bengal, but that model has been applied to other places as well. So while his formulations are largely true for Bengal, they often may not work in the context of other regions. So, if you look at other regions, if you look at caste variations, then you get a different kind of picture. So, for example, in North India, where I have done my work mainly, reformist endeavors and the women's question did not fade away with the nationalist movement. In fact, they coincided with each other. They reached their peak precisely in the period, which coincided with the nationalist movement. So, for example, J. Devika has argued in the context of, Kerala, she says that, nationalist movement was never totally successful in situating the woman's question in an inner domain of sovereignty, removed from the arena of political contest with the colonial state. So basically, the messy terrain of private and public impinged on each other. And जिस समय सुधार हो रहे थे, उसी समय अगर आप कास्ट मूवमेंट्स देखें, अगर आप अम्बेडकर, पेरियार, इनके आंदोलन देखते हैं, so this was the time when actually the woman's question emerged in very, very important ways in these anti-caste movements, etc. And they brought the question of gender in very new ways in early 20th century. There have also been subaltern historians who have, emphasized non-elite perspectives. In some ways, they also point to the coercive power of modernity itself, and they argue that the central question regarding women in 19th century was not what women want, but how to modernize them, and this came with its own coercive package. This is one of the arguments that has been made by subaltern historians.